Hi there, it's Karen from Vintage Style Journals. I'm just going to show you a very quick video on how I make my wet palette. I've got a new container here that I've purchased just this morning. It cost me $10 and it's got a nice lid on it. It's a good size, probably an A3 or thereabouts size. And I've decided to make a new one because my old one, this cactus, I'll just show you. This is my old palette. This is a very well-worn palette. I've had it for many years now, and it only cost me a few bucks. It wasn't very expensive, but I've pretty much been using this for so long. I just thought it was time that I actually got a new one, and in getting my new one, I've decided I just want to show you how to get a wet palette happening. As you can see, these paints are quite wet there. I've got them on a dish kind of wipe underneath. Normally I would use either this or some absorbent paper. I think the absorbent paper is a little bit better because it's got a white background, and anything that's on a white background gives you a better idea of the true colour, whereas the blue or a darker colour background will make your colours look a little bit different on the surface. Even though they're the same colour, you don't get the best appearance of colour when you've got a darker background. So I'm going to be using the white paper towel in my new palette that I make. And this area here is just where I blend the colours before I actually put them onto my work. So as you can see, it's pretty well used, and really I think it's time for it to go. I might hang on to it just in case I need to have something extra apart from this lovely big one that I'm going to use. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I've had these paints in here for at least 2 weeks, and they're still beautiful and wet, and they're the Jo Sonja brand gouache, and that's the paint that I love to paint with, and they don't give me any money for advertising that. It's just that they're beautiful pigments, and they will stand the test of time with all their colours, so that's the reason why I use them. And I've only ever taught with these colours, but I'm sure there are other paints on the market that you prefer, and that's perfectly fine. You're choosing day. You choose what you like. This is just what I like. So I'm just going to move that, put the lid back on. It's actually not a hard grip lid. It just sort of sits over it, and this has kept this palette wet for the last couple of weeks. So I don't believe in wasting products, even though they're reasonably priced. When you see how much you use them, it's good to actually try and keep them from drying out. I used to use just a plain paper palette that you can tear off, and I just found that the paints just dried out far too quickly if you have to step away from them for a time. There they are, dry on your palette, and it's a lot of waste involved. So that's why I use the wet palette. Now this here is just a box that I got from a cheap craft shop today. Well, actually not a craft shop, sort of like a shop that sells everything. You know those shops that I'm talking about. And this, I think, is meant to be for scrapbook paper. You can see the width of it there is not very wide. The lid is a lot more narrow than the base. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn it over, and I'm going to use the lid as my palette base. And I'm going to try and stay in shot there. So what I'll do is I'll just, without any further talking and not doing anything, I've just got some paper here that I've prepared earlier just to fit here. It's just doubled over absorbent paper. And if you buy the rolls, it's just 3 pieces that I've just doubled over here just to fit in the palette well. And the same with a different type of absorbent paper. I'm not sure why I used 2 different types, but anyway, it's still all going to do the job. So we'll just place that in, get that in there. It's probably just a little bit wider than I need, but that's okay. And then just all you need to do is pour some water over it. Make it as wet as you can. Doesn't matter if these things are too wet, because that's what you need for a wet palette. You can always tip off a little bit of the water if you don't need it. As you can see, I must have dried a brush out or actually used that bit of paper for just to wipe my brush at some point. Okay, so that's nice and wet. Just going to pat it down. It's going to be a little bit thicker in the middle where it joins. You can actually have that or not. You might have a smaller palette in mind. It doesn't matter that these are over like that, because I'll just push them down. The other thing that I've got here as well is just the idea of just a small plastic container, you know, like some of the takeaway containers. You can use the lid for the palette section, and this one here. So if you just use one of these for putting the paper down, so for instance this amount of paper, and then just put parchment paper over top. Once you've got your palette all set up, then all you need to do is stick the base over for a lid. So if you just want a very small palette, that's an idea. These things I find tend to be a little bit not flat along the bottom, so when I put it down, it wouldn't be sitting flat up against the base. So probably good if you're going to use this and go out and paint out in the field. That'd probably be the ideal one to take, because you've just got a little palette to worry about. All right, so that's nice and wet. Just going to place the parchment paper. And when I say parchment paper, I mean baking paper. In Australia, we use this stuff by the roll. Very good for laying out biscuits on a tray so that you don't get the tray dirty. And I'm just flattening out the paper over the palette. So that's giving me a really good surface to paint on there. Just make sure that you keep popping it down at the sides. What I've done in the past is, instead of just sitting the paper on, I've actually curled it under, and you can do that too. It'll just save you having to worry about the sides being curling up. I don't think they will curl up, but if you want to just not have that problem, just curl your paper underneath your parchment paper, your absorbent paper. So yeah, this is just baking paper that I've used. This stuff that comes in a roll. Get it in a various size rolls. I use the Glad Bake one, but there are other products out on the market that are equally as wonderful, and it's a really cheap option for a palette. I thought before I did this I might just have a look at the prices of the various palettes out there on the market, and oh my goodness, I could not believe that they're flogging these palettes for $70 for something this size, when I've paid $10 for this. And you know, you might have some at home already with your scrapbooking papers in them. But yeah, use what you have. There's no need to go out and buy a mastered and stay wet palette unless you've got big dollars to use. And yes, they are a very good product, but there's nothing a lot different about them than what I'm actually presenting here. So this is nice and wet. What actually happens is the paper, the absorbent paper underneath that is soaking wet, actually comes up through the baking paper and just creates a little moist surface here. So it actually it's like a semi-permeable membrane, so it actually allows a certain amount of that moisture to come through and sit just on the paper here. So when I put my paint out, I'll just shake my tubes here because they've been sitting for a little while. It just depends on how you like to set out your palette. I like to set out my palette with white at one end. If I'm using white, most of the time I will use white in whatever I paint. So I'll put that out at one end, and I'll put my other colours probably along this side here, so that I've got all this section to paint in. Now I'm going to be doing some painting today. I thought I might show you how to make a quick iris, but that's going to be in my next video. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put out a palette on the paint surface here. And this is actually Dioxazine or Diox Purple. Just pop some of that out there because this is part of the... Just have to push it out. It's been sitting there for a while. I did shake it. So there we go. And I'm going to use some permanent alizarin, which is a beautiful, beautiful crimsony kind of colour. Going to set that next to the purple deox there. And what actually happens with this Stay Wet palette is that the moisture will come up underneath the base of the paint. So there, unless you're a little finicky in the way that you do things, there is no reason to put any medium with this unless you need to water it down to an inky consistency. And then I would recommend that you do actually use a flow medium. And obviously the Dress On You brand have all their mediums connected to their paint, and you can use any medium brand that you particularly prefer. But if you want to use a watered down inky consistency, for instance, if you're painting using a fine liner brush, then you would certainly need an inky consistency, because if you don't, then your paintbrush is just going to be blobby, and the lines that you're trying to produce with your liner brush are just going to be thick, blobby looking lines. So you do have to determine what thickness the paint needs to be, and I would recommend that you do use the mediums. There are quite a few, but I typically use a flow medium if I want to use a inky consistency, because what happens is water's fine, but it actually waters down the binder in the paint rather than yes, it does make it flow a lot better, but if you use the flow medium, which is created for the paint, it actually doesn't water down or reduce the effect of the binder that binds the paint and the medium together. So just a little tip. And so yeah, this is my wet palette. This is what I'm going to be using when I create my next video. Going to be teaching some extremely quick and easy irises for anybody to be able to paint with a round brush. So all I will do now is I'll pop the lid, which is actually the base of this container, over there, and that's going to stay quite wet for weeks if I want it to last for weeks. The only thing that you need to consider is if you're having it for too long, and it will definitely stay wet for as long as you need it to, but just be aware that you don't want to create an environment where mold will start to produce, because if that happens, then you may as well just toss out your palette. But once you're finished with these colours and this surface area here, all you need to do is just throw the inside out, and it's cheap. It's paper towel, for heaven's sake. It's nothing. You can buy those, you know, for a couple of dollars, the big roll, and the same with the baking paper. So it is a very, very cheap option, and just equally as good an option as the other market brands that are out there. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I'd really love it if you would subscribe to my channel, if that's how you feel, and if you think that this has been a useful little section, just give me a tick. So thank you so much for watching.